I'm 61 now, and I've kept this to myself for 9 years, not because I'm proud of it, and not because it makes me feel special, but because the moment you put something like this into the wrong hands, it stops being a truth and becomes a target. People hear Bigfoot, and they don't hear a living thing. They hear a story they can own, a clip they can post, a rumor they can chase until it breaks. So I stayed quiet. I filed a report that said almost nothing. I let the town move on with a version that felt safer. And I carried the real version like a weight in my chest, because I'm the one who saw what happens when fear gets the first word. Back then, I was Mason Gray, veteran cop in a rural county where the line between public safety and people spooking themselves gets blurry. I wasn't the kind of officer who went looking for mystery. I was practical. I'd been on too many calls where the truth was always smaller than the rumor. A bear rummaging through trash, a teenager in a costume, a shadow cast wrong by headlights. I knew the rhythm of panic, and I knew how quickly a town can work itself into a frenzy when the woods are close and the nights are long. I lived alone, worked too much, and took pride in being the calm voice in the middle of other people's storms. I thought that made me prepared for anything. It didn't. The reports started coming in from the stretch of road that cuts along the forest like a knife. Drivers claiming something huge crossed the headlights too fast to be counted. Families saying they heard heavy movement near their backyard fences. Then silence, the kind of silence that makes you feel watched. A few folks swore they saw a shape standing upright between the trees, not rushing, not prowling, just there. The town did what towns do. People amplified the story to make it feel less scary, then panicked anyway. Someone called it an aggressive animal. Someone else called it a man in a suit. Somebody said the word monster, and suddenly everyone had a cousin who knew someone who heard it breathe. When dispatch told me to go alone and check it out, I didn't argue. I was the senior guy, the one who handled nonsense without making it bigger. In my mind, I'd already decided what it was. If it was a bear pushing too close to homes, I'd guide it away. No drama. If it was someone trying to scare families, I'd end it with a warning and a pair of cuffs. Either way, I told myself, it would be simple. I drove out there with that tired certainty you get when you've been right about 100 problems in a row, not realizing that confidence can be its own kind of blindness. The forest looked normal at first. That was the trick of it. Trees, fog, wet soil, the same smell of pine and river silt. The road shoulder was soft with mud from recent rain, and my boots left prints that felt too loud in the quiet. I walked in a few yards, scanning for anything that looked like a den, a dragged branch, a broken fence line. I found nothing obvious, but the longer I stood there, the more I noticed what wasn't happening. No birds singing, no squirrels arguing. The woods weren't empty. They were paused, like every small animal was holding its breath. Then I saw the footprints. Not prints like a deer, not scat like a bear. Prints that made my brain refuse them at first, because my brain wanted the world to stay orderly. They were deep, wide impressions in the soft ground, too long to be a trick of angle, too heavy to be a joke. The stride between them wasn't frantic. It wasn't the pattern of something running. It was measured, controlled. As if whatever made them had all the time in the world and no need to prove anything. I crouched down, fingertips hovering above the impression without touching it, because touching makes something real. That's what my mind told me. Don't touch it, and you can still call it a misunderstanding. I was still trying to save myself from the conclusion forming in my chest. I stood up slowly, and that's when I felt it. An awareness behind my shoulder, the unmistakable sensation of being observed from somewhere that wasn't the road. I turned, and she was there. A girl, thin, barefoot, standing between two trees like she belonged to the space more than the space belonged to her. Her hair was tangled but not filthy. Her clothes improvised out of layers that looked scavenged and repaired. And her eyes were the kind you don't forget once you've seen them. Alert, intelligent, older than her face. She didn't rush at me, didn't beg, didn't flinch. She watched me the way a cautious person watches an animal they respect but don't fully trust. For a split second, my training tried to put her into a category: runaway, lost hiker, neglect case. But none of those labels fit the way she stood. Steady, balanced, as if the forest had taught her exactly where to place her weight so the ground wouldn't betray her. She lifted one hand. Not a wave, not a threat. A stop, a warning. Then, in a voice so low it barely disturbed the air, she said it. "Don't shoot." It wasn't a command meant to challenge me. It was urgent in a different way, like a person trying to stop a tragedy they've already seen play out in their mind. My mouth opened, and a dozen questions tried to come out at once. Who are you? Are you alone? Where are your parents? What are you doing out here? But something in her expression told me questions were noise. Noise was danger. She didn't move closer. Instead, she pointed, two fingers extended toward the deeper shadows, where the trees thickened and the fog pooled. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It was precise, like she was indicating a fact, not telling a story. I followed her point with my eyes. At first, I saw nothing, just trunks and branches and gray mist. Then the mist shifted, and the forest did that strange thing where depth suddenly becomes clear, like your eyes finally accept what they've been refusing to process. Something large was there, not stepping into view, not charging, not showing itself for attention. Just present in the dark, still enough that the trees almost hid it by accident. The size was wrong, the shape was wrong, but the feeling it gave me wasn't predatory. It was watchful, cautious, like the forest itself had grown a heartbeat. My instincts tightened, not into panic, into readiness. The old habit of protecting people. The old belief that if something unknown is near the road, you neutralize the threat before it reaches a family's porch. My fingers twitched near where they'd normally rest on my gear, and that's when the girl's eyes sharpened. Not with anger, but with a kind of pleading intensity that hit me harder than any shouted warning could have. "Don't shoot," she repeated, quieter this time, like repeating it might make it stick inside me. I didn't understand her yet. I only understood that she was afraid, not of the thing in the shadows, but of what I might do, and what others would do if fear started moving faster than thought. I forced myself to breathe slower, to widen my stance, to keep my hands visible, to let my posture say I wasn't going to rush into a decision I couldn't take back. The girl watched every micro movement I made, as if she'd learned the hard way that humans change the world with one sudden choice. And then I heard it. Not a growl, not a roar, nothing theatrical, just the soft crack of a branch somewhere far off to my left, followed by a second sound that didn't belong to the forest. Distant human voices, too loud, carrying that sharp edge of excitement people get when they're chasing a story, the kind of voices that don't whisper because they want the woods to hear them. The girl's head snapped toward the sound. Her shoulders tightened. Her eyes flicked back to me like she was checking whether I understood the real danger now. I did, because whatever was in the shadows had been hiding. But the humans coming through those trees, they weren't hiding at all. And in that moment, standing between a quiet giant I couldn't explain and a wild girl who had just tried to stop me from making a mistake, I realized the situation wasn't about what I was sent to investigate. It was about what I was about to prevent, if I was smart enough to listen. The first thing I did was not heroic. It was not brave. It was simply restraint, which is harder than people think when your entire job has trained you to act fast. I backed up one slow step, then another, keeping my body angled away from the shadows so I wouldn't look like a challenge, and I kept my hands open where the girl could see them. I didn't even look directly at the shape between the trees for too long, because the longer I stared, the more my brain tried to name it. And naming things is how humans begin to claim them. The girl watched me like she was reading a language I didn't know I was speaking. Every breath, every shift of weight, every choice not to move too quickly. And when she saw I wasn't going to do anything sudden, her shoulders dropped by a fraction. It was the smallest release of tension, but it told me everything. She wasn't asking me to be fearless. She was asking me to be careful. The voices grew closer. I could tell there were several people, moving without patience, talking over one another, laughing in short bursts that didn't fit the quiet of the woods. Their excitement had that brittle edge of fear underneath it, like they were trying to prove they were in control by being loud. The girl didn't wait for them to appear. She shifted her gaze to the ground, to the low brush, to the spaces between roots, and she began to move in a way that looked almost effortless. Not running, not darting, just slipping along a line only she could see. She made a small motion with her hand, a simple "come" that didn't feel like an order. It felt like a warning that time was thinning. I followed, slower than her, but trying not to crash through the undergrowth like a clumsy intruder. Even then, I could feel the giant presence behind us retreating deeper into shadow. Not aggressive, not chasing, withdrawn, like a cornered animal choosing invisibility because it knows humans bring consequences. We angled through a narrow stretch where the trees grew tighter and the ground rose slightly, keeping us out of the line of sight from the main path. I could still hear the group now, close enough to catch words. Big, monster, prove it, get a picture. Nothing that sounded like measured concern for safety. Everything that sounded like adrenaline and rumor. I stepped out just far enough to intercept them without looking like I was hiding anything, and I used the only weapon that works on excited people: boredom. I told them the area was being assessed for instability after the rain, that there were risks near the river slope, that they needed to turn back. Some of them scoffed. One of them tried to argue about public land. Another made a joke that landed wrong. The kind of joke people make when they're scared and want to pretend they aren't. I didn't escalate, didn't bark, didn't turn it into a standoff. I held my tone steady and gave them a simple choice: leave now or spend the morning answering questions back at the road. That was enough, at least for the moment, to slow them. They didn't disappear immediately, but they drifted, grumbling, toward the direction I pointed them, and that bought the forest a few more minutes of quiet. When I returned to where the girl had led me, she was waiting, still at a distance, still half merged with the trees, eyes fixed on me as if she needed to confirm I'd done what she hoped I would do. I didn't speak. I didn't ask. I simply nodded once, the smallest possible signal that I understood the basic rule: don't make this bigger. Her gaze flicked back toward the deeper woods where the shadows had thickened again, and she lowered herself into a crouch, pressing her fingers into the mud as if reading it. Then she drew a short line on a flat stone with something sharp, wiped it away, and drew it again, slower. The motion wasn't random. It was teaching. She was showing me that signs matter and that the forest remembers. It took me longer than I like to admit to realize the biggest shock of that morning wasn't the impossible tracks or the size of what I'd glimpsed. It was the girl herself. How deliberate she was, how composed, how much she seemed to understand the difference between danger and attention. People in town would have called her wild because it made them feel superior, but she didn't move like someone abandoned by the world. She moved like someone trained by necessity. Her caution wasn't confusion. It was strategy. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was discipline. And beneath all that, there was something else that kept catching me off guard, an odd gentleness in the way she treated the space around her, as if she saw the woods as a living home, rather than a backdrop. She didn't break branches casually. She didn't step on things she didn't need to. Even her footsteps felt like an apology to the ground. The next time she let me see the giant clearly, it wasn't because I'd demanded it. It was because she decided I needed to understand the truth quickly, before other humans forced the situation into something it didn't have to become. She guided me, always at that careful distance, through a bend where the earth dipped into a shallow ravine and the air cooled as though the trees were holding on to night. We reached a tight clearing, narrow enough that sound couldn't travel far, and there he was. The Bigfoot, fully visible for a heartbeat before the fog tried to swallow him again. He was immense, taller and broader than any man I'd ever arrested or helped or pulled from a wreck. But the first thing I noticed wasn't his size, it was his posture. He wasn't standing like a conqueror. He was angled away, shoulders hunched slightly, weight balanced as if ready to retreat. His breathing was heavy, not in rage, but in strain, like he'd been moving for hours with a body that was tired. There were scratches along his side, not fresh, not dramatic. Just the kind of marks you get from pushing through thorny undergrowth while trying to avoid being seen. And his eyes were what made my chest tighten. They weren't empty. They weren't animal. They held something like recognition, an awareness that I was a human, that humans bring noise, and that noise brings trouble. The girl stayed close enough to him that it was obvious she'd done this before. Approached him, calmed him, directed him when the forest needed him to move. She didn't cling to him like a child seeking protection, and she didn't treat him like a pet. She treated him like a person who had boundaries, like a being that deserved respect. That alone shattered every lazy assumption I'd carried into the woods that morning. This wasn't a monster hiding to hunt. This was a creature hiding to survive. And the girl, this so-called wild girl, wasn't his victim. She was his link to safety. In the days that followed, my life quietly rearranged itself around Dawn, and it happened so gradually that if you'd asked me at the time, I would have said nothing had changed. But everything had. I began returning before the town woke up, not to track them, not to catch them, but to keep the river bend from becoming a stage. I learned which trails people favored, which pull-offs teenagers used, which times outsiders arrived hoping to film something. I didn't create a spectacle. I did the opposite. I made the area boring. I redirected traffic. I put up simple notices about seasonal hazards. I spoke to locals in the calm, tired tone that makes rumors lose oxygen. And each time I managed to keep humans from pushing deeper. The girl's posture softened by degrees, as if she could feel the pressure ease. Communication grew between us in the only way it could, through pattern and patience. She began leaving marks in places I would notice. 3 shallow lines on bark, a circle scratched into dirt, a stone placed upright where it hadn't been before. At first I thought it was random until I saw the repetition. 3 lines meant safe. A circle meant wait. 2 angled cuts meant danger near. I started responding with my own predictable behavior, stopping when she signaled, staying back when she held her palm up, moving only when she moved first. I didn't try to touch her. I didn't try to save her in the way the world would define saving. I let her exist on her own terms, because I was beginning to understand that the greatest threat to her wasn't the forest. It was being dragged into a life she didn't choose by people who wanted to feel like heroes. And then, just when the tension had begun to feel manageable, she surprised me with something that cracked open the hard shell of my professionalism. One morning I found a small object placed on the flat rock where I always waited. A carved piece of wood, roughly shaped like a badge, the edges uneven. The symbol, clumsy in a way that felt intentional, like humor disguised as craftsmanship. It was an imitation of my world, but not mocking. Curious, almost playful. I stood there holding it, and despite myself, I felt a warmth that made my eyes sting. That tiny carving told me she wasn't just surviving on instinct. She was watching me, learning me, and somehow, against every reason, she'd decided I was safe enough to joke with. The moment was simple, almost light, and it made the heavier parts hurt more, because once you feel empathy for someone, the idea of them being hunted by attention becomes unbearable. Seasons turned. The forest changed color, then shed itself, then returned to green. The girl grew stronger, her movements more assured. The Bigfoot remained cautious, always near but never careless, like he understood exactly how thin the line was between being hidden and being claimed. And I aged in a different way than my body showed. I began thinking about time like a ticking thing, not because I feared dying, but because I feared leaving them without whatever small protection I'd become. It wasn't a romantic thought. It was practical and heavy. I could keep redirecting people now, but what about later? What happens when I retire? What happens when my knees don't carry me quietly through wet brush at dawn? What happens when my name no longer carries authority on that road shoulder? That's when the question lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. What happens when I'm gone? Who stops the next wave of curiosity? Who keeps the rumors from hardening into obsession? Who stands between a fragile existence and a world that thinks everything unusual exists to be photographed, explained, and shared? I didn't get long to sit with that question, because the threat evolved the way threats always do. It changed shape and found a new door. A few out-of-town hikers began showing up at odd hours. Someone posted about weird prints near the river. A local podcast mentioned the forest giant, with the giddy tone of people who've never paid the cost of being wrong. Then, one afternoon, I overheard a conversation at a gas station that made my blood go cold. Men from another county talking about going in deep before the authorities ruin the fun, speaking like the woods were an amusement park and the Bigfoot was a prize no one had claimed yet. It wasn't a direct threat, not on paper, but it was a clear sign. The story was traveling beyond the town, and traveling stories always come back bigger and hungrier. The next morning, the girl's signals changed. She didn't appear at the usual bend. She didn't leave 3 safe lines. Instead, she left a single mark carved into a tree near the road. An unfamiliar symbol, a circle split by a vertical line, cut deeper than anything she'd done before. It looked less like communication and more like warning, like she'd pressed fear into wood so it couldn't be ignored. When she finally emerged from the fog, she didn't linger in the calm way she had started to. She looked past me toward the road, listening, tense, as if she could hear things I couldn't yet hear. And then I heard it too. Distant footsteps, multiple, approaching with purpose, not wandering hikers, not curious teenagers, something more organized, more determined, more certain that the forest owed them an answer. The girl's eyes locked on mine, sharp and urgent again, returning to that first morning's intensity. And I knew the fragile routine we'd built, quiet, careful, controlled, was about to be tested by the one force the forest can't soften: human obsession. The group that was coming in that morning didn't sound like confused hikers. They sounded coordinated, confident, and hungry in a way that made the forest feel smaller. I caught flashes of reflective tape through the trees, the cold white beam of handheld lights slicing the fog, and the unmistakable cadence of people who had convinced themselves they were on a mission. Not to help anyone. Not to protect anyone. To prove something. That kind of certainty is dangerous because it doesn't leave room for reality to be more complicated than the story in their heads. I stepped out early and tried to turn them around with authority and calm. No shouting, no threats, no escalation. Just the dull, procedural tone that usually drains excitement. But they didn't drain. They argued, they grinned, they treated my presence like an obstacle in their adventure. One of them even filmed me, and I felt a wave of anger so sharp it surprised me because it wasn't anger on my behalf. It was anger for what they were about to do to a fragile, unseen life just by chasing it too loudly. That's when I realized I couldn't keep solving this with my badge alone. A badge works on people who still believe in order. These men believed in attention. So I did something I'd avoided until then. I pulled someone else into the orbit of my secret, not fully, not recklessly, but enough to create a wider shield. I called a county conservation officer I trusted, Cal Hargrove, a man who had spent more time in these woods than in his own living room, and who understood that wildlife management wasn't about dominance, it was about balance. I didn't tell him I'd seen the Bigfoot. I didn't need to. I told him the truth that mattered. Outsiders were moving in aggressively. The area was becoming a spectacle, and we needed a legitimate reason to lock down the trailheads before somebody got hurt by panic, by accidents, by bad decisions made in crowds. Cal didn't ask for gossip, asked for coordinates and timing. Within hours, official closure signs appeared where they would actually be obeyed, and a couple of marked vehicles sat in the right places like silent warnings. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would fuel the story, just enough pressure to squeeze the oxygen out of the hunt. Even with that help, the threat didn't vanish. It adapted. The most determined ones didn't come in through the main paths anymore. They started cutting in from the edges, parking farther down the road, slipping through brush like they'd watched too many videos about tracking. And they brought new tools that turned my stomach. Not weapons, not the obvious kind of danger, but the modern kind. Drones, thermal viewers, speakers to call something out, bright lights meant to force movement. It was like watching people try to tear a secret out of the woods with technology and impatience. The wild girl responded by changing everything again. She stopped using the riverbend entirely. She moved our meeting point deeper, away from roads and away from places where a stranger's footfall could easily become a trail. The first time I followed her into that deeper corridor, the forest felt different. Denser, quieter, insulated. I realized she wasn't just hiding, she was routing us through spaces that naturally swallowed sound and confused direction, places that seemed designed to keep the reckless from wandering too far. And then, one dawn, she led me to a narrow clearing I hadn't seen before, a place that felt like a pocket stitched into the woods. The Bigfoot was there, and this time I didn't only register his size, I registered the way he held himself when the world was too close. His posture carried a restrained tension, like he was fighting the instinct to bolt, forcing himself to remain still because stillness was safer than flight. The girl moved with quiet confidence near him, not dominating him, not clinging, just existing within, his boundaries like she'd earned the right to be there. That alone was enough to rewrite what most people would assume, because it showed me their relationship wasn't fear-based. It was built on understanding, on long practice, on trust that had been tested by many unseen mornings before I ever stepped into their story. The moment that changed me happened when the drones came. I heard the buzz first, faint, distant, but wrong in the way anything mechanical is wrong inside a living forest. The wild girl's entire body tightened, as if that sound hit a nerve she'd learned to protect. She looked up through the canopy, scanning the gaps between branches, and I watched the Bigfoot's attention shift in the same direction, immediate and focused. The drone wasn't directly above us yet, but it was searching, looping, sweeping, and I felt an ugly certainty settle into my chest. Even if nobody found them today, this kind of pressure would keep returning until the woods were mapped and measured and stripped of mystery. The girl made a quick, sharp signal, one I hadn't seen before, and started guiding us toward thicker cover. I followed, but my human clumsiness betrayed me. A slick root shifted under my boot, and I went down hard enough to knock the air out of my lungs. It wasn't a dramatic fall, but it was loud, and in that pocket of quiet, loud was an alarm. What happened next is the part I replay in my mind when the nights get too long. The Bigfoot moved. Not toward me as a threat, not toward the drone as a challenge, but toward the wild girl with an urgency that looked like protection made instinct. He placed himself between her and the open gap in the canopy as the drone's buzz grew closer, using his own body like a shield from sight lines, then nudged her back into deeper shadow with a gentleness that didn't match any monster story I'd ever heard. It wasn't violence, it wasn't aggression, it was care. And when he glanced at me, just once, I saw something I still struggle to describe without sounding like I'm begging you to believe me. Not anger, not hunger, but a clear awareness that I was part of the problem he'd been forced to live with. Humans bring machines. Humans bring noise. Humans bring the kind of attention that never stops once it starts. The wild girl didn't panic. She did something even more telling. She waited until I pushed myself up, until my breathing steadied, until I was on my feet again. Only then did she lead us deeper, as if she refused to abandon me even though I didn't belong in her world. That small choice, staying with me instead of vanishing, hit like a quiet promise. I began to understand that her warning from the beginning wasn't just about one impulsive act. It was about the chain reaction that starts when humans decide fear gives them permission to take control. She didn't want me to be the spark that turned their careful hiding into a chase. After that, I started preparing for the future the way you prepare for bad weather, by assuming it will come no matter how much you wish it wouldn't. I documented without exposing. Times, patterns, the kinds of outsiders showing up, the tools they used, the points along the road where curiosity clustered. I kept notes in plain language that wouldn't sound insane if discovered, but would be enough for the right person to understand what I was trying to protect. Cal helped create longer closures under the dullest legal reasons imaginable: habitat rehabilitation, trail maintenance, erosion control, because boredom is sometimes the best fence. And I began writing sealed letters to myself, the kind you leave behind when you know your silence might outlive you. Instructions on what to reveal and what never to reveal, what to hand to officials if pressure became impossible, and what to keep buried because exposure would do more harm than any lie. But the forest doesn't let you pretend time is unlimited. The wild girl started arriving with a new kind of urgency, not frantic, but purposeful, like she was compressing her life into fewer, more meaningful appearances. She began leaving fewer playful signs and more directional ones, marks that didn't say safe, but move. The Bigfoot seemed more restless too. Not aggressive, just strained, like he could feel the perimeter tightening around them. The drones returned more frequently. Out-of-town license plates multiplied. A local social media page started posting updates like it was tracking a sports team. And then something happened that told me the pressure had crossed a line. One morning I found a small reflective strip tied to a branch near an old access route, an outsider's marker placed too close to the corridor the girl favored. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't a threat in the obvious sense. It was worse. It was proof that someone had begun mapping their movements, turning their hiding places into coordinates. That afternoon, Cal called me with a voice that sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before. He told me, in the most careful language possible, that higher offices had started asking questions about the closures, that there were complaints, that someone with influence wanted a proper look because the public deserves answers. And in that moment, all my careful, boring strategies felt fragile, like paper shields in rain. I could handle rumors, I could handle curiosity, but bureaucracy has its own hunger, and once it turns its attention toward a place, it doesn't look away easily. The next dawn, the wild girl didn't wait at any of our usual points. She appeared close enough that I could see the fine lines of fatigue around her eyes, close enough that I could see she'd been moving all night. She pressed a small object into the mud at my feet. A flat piece of bark with a symbol carved deep, deeper than any mark she'd made before. A circle. Then a line. Then an arrow angled away from the road. A route, a decision, a departure. She looked past me toward the faint sound of engines somewhere far off, then back into my face as if she was measuring whether I could accept what she was about to do. She didn't plead. She didn't explain. She simply made the same stop gesture she'd made on the first day, the gesture that had become the foundation of everything between us. And then she turned toward the deeper trees, the direction the arrow pointed, and moved with a finality that made my chest tighten because I suddenly understood. This wasn't another adjustment to our routine. This was the beginning of an ending. I followed for a few steps, then stopped, because the symbol on the bark wasn't only a map. It was a boundary, a warning that if I crossed the wrong line, I might drag the world behind me. So I stood there, alone in the thinning fog, holding that carved bark like it was a farewell letter, listening to the distant engine sounds grow louder, and realizing the irreversible truth that I had been avoiding since the start. No matter how careful I was, the story was catching up. And soon I would have to choose public truth or private protection before the forest made the choice for me. By the time the sun rose fully, the forest no longer sounded like a refuge. It sounded like a place being searched, not aggressively, not with shouting or chaos, but with the steady persistence of people who believe they're entitled to an answer. Distant engines idled, doors opened and closed, radios crackled in clipped official tones. It was the sound of a perimeter forming. Soft power, paperwork power, the kind of power that doesn't look like cruelty until you're the one being pushed out of your own life by it. Cal's closures had slowed the pressure, but now pressure had found a new path. Complaints, inquiries, public safety assessments, the language that allows the world to put its hands on anything it wants to touch. And as that pressure expanded, I realized what I'd been pretending not to know. If this continued, the wild girl and the Bigfoot would either be forced into deeper and deeper hiding until something went wrong, or they'd be exposed in a way that turned their existence into permanent pursuit. I spent that day doing something that felt like betrayal and protection at the same time. I stayed visible near the road to absorb attention, talking to officials, answering harmless questions with the most boring facts I could offer, guiding people away from the deeper routes with dull warnings about unstable ground and protected habitat. The goal wasn't to win. The goal was to redirect momentum, to keep the crowd's gravity from pulling too far inward. But every minute I stood out there playing the role of helpful veteran cop, I felt the clock inside my chest tightening. Because I knew the wild girl had moved on without me, and I didn't know whether she meant move deeper or move away. I didn't know whether she meant goodbye or trust me. And the not knowing started to feel like a physical ache. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my notes spread out like a confession I wasn't ready to speak. For years, I had controlled the story by refusing to give it oxygen. Now the story was breathing without my permission. I kept thinking about the girl's first words to me, "Don't shoot," and how I had misunderstood them at the start. I thought she was asking me not to see danger. What she was really asking was something deeper. Don't let fear take the lead, because fear makes humans do irreversible things, even when they swear they're protecting people. Fear doesn't just create harm. Fear creates obsession. It creates crowds. It creates the kind of attention that never stops once it finds a scent. Before dawn, I drove out alone, not to chase them, but to offer the only thing I still could, a last chance for quiet. I parked far from the main pull-off, walked the long way through damp brush, and followed the direction of the arrow the girl had carved into bark. I moved slowly, carefully, trying to leave as little trace as possible, because by then, I understood that even my footprints could be a betrayal if the wrong person followed them. The forest felt awake in a different way, less calm, more alert. I could hear faint activity far behind me, but ahead there was only the low hush of leaves and the dull thump of my own heartbeat. I found the first sign near a cluster of rocks, where the ground dipped into a shallow, shadowed corridor. A small stack of stones arranged too neatly to be natural, placed beside a tree with 3 familiar lines cut into the bark. Safe. I stood there for a long moment, letting relief wash through me so hard it made my knees feel weak. She was still speaking to me. She hadn't cut me out. I followed the corridor deeper, and the light thinned under the canopy, as if the forest was lowering its voice. Then I saw them. Not in the open, not posed, not performing. The wild girl sat near the base of a fallen tree, shoulders drawn in, watching the world through gaps in the leaves like someone listening for a storm. The Bigfoot stood behind her, partially hidden by trunk and shadow, so still he looked carved from bark. The size of him still made my mind stumble, but the feeling he gave off wasn't threat. It was vigilance, the posture of a being who had learned that attention is danger. And when I stepped into view, the wild girl didn't flinch away. She simply lifted her eyes to mine, and something in her expression told me this wasn't a normal meeting. This was a farewell. I didn't approach too close. I didn't rush to help. I stayed where the forest seemed to permit me to stand. The girl reached into a cloth bundle at her side and pulled out something wrapped in plastic. Careful wrapping, practiced wrapping, the same preservation habit I'd seen in every sign she left. She placed it on the ground between us, then nudged it forward with her fingertips. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of a decision. She was giving me something she didn't want the world to find, but she wanted me to keep. I lowered myself slowly, picked it up, and unwrapped it just enough to see what it was. A small, flat piece of wood, smooth, carved, and familiar. It was the wooden badge she'd made years ago, the one that had once made me feel a rare flicker of warmth in the middle of all this tension. But now it was different. A new mark had been carved into it, deep and deliberate, a circle split by a vertical line, the warning symbol she'd used when the pressure became serious. And beneath it, scratched in uneven letters, there was a single word that turned my throat tight. Remember. It wasn't proof meant for court. It wasn't evidence meant for a crowd. It was a message meant for one person, the person who had been allowed to witness without taking. I lifted my gaze, and that's when the extraordinary thing happened, the kind of thing that would sound ridiculous if I hadn't lived it. The Bigfoot stepped forward by half a pace, not aggressively, not invading, just enough to be clearly seen. He lowered his head slightly and placed one large hand, not on me, not on the girl, on the fallen trunk between us, fingers spreading as if to anchor himself. Then he looked at me with a steadiness that felt almost intentional, and he did something I still can't fully translate, except with the simplest word. He acknowledged me. Not like an animal reacting to a threat, but like a being recognizing a boundary and respecting the fact that I'd respected it too. And then the wild girl spoke again. Quiet, controlled, like speech was something she used only when it mattered more than safety. She didn't give me a story. She didn't explain origins. She didn't try to convince me. She said softly, like a vow, "Don't show." That was it. Not "don't tell," not "don't ever," not a demand born of fear, a request shaped by experience. Don't show them where we are, don't turn us into a destination, don't convert a living, fragile existence into a place on a map. In that moment, I finally understood what the worst really was. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't some violent showdown. It wasn't the creature doing something monstrous. The worst was humans arriving with certainty and tools and excitement, thinking they were brave, while not realizing they were about to destroy the very thing they claimed to fear. Because once people believe they're owed a spectacle, they don't stop. They justify, they escalate, they chase, and the chased either disappear forever or become a story told by strangers who never cared about the truth, only about the thrill of it. I didn't promise her out loud. I didn't need to. I nodded once, the smallest signal I had, and I saw her shoulders drop the way they had on the very first morning, as if a pressure inside her finally loosened. That was the goodbye. Not dramatic, not cinematic, quiet, complete. The wild girl stood, wrapped, the cloth bundle tightly, and stepped backward into the trees. The Bigfoot moved with her, not her leash, not her guard dog, her shadow, her shelter, her chosen distance from the human world. They didn't run. They didn't perform. They simply melted into the forest in a way that made my eyes doubt themselves, as if the woods had decided to close around them and erase the seam where they'd been. I stayed still long after they vanished, holding that carved wooden badge in my hand like it was the last warm thing in winter. When I finally returned to the road, the officials were still there. The questions were still floating. The hungry curiosity was still pushing at the edges. And I made my decision with a clarity that felt like grief. I would not give the world what it wanted. I would give it only what it needed to stop digging. My report was clean, dull, and unsatisfying. I wrote about false sightings, about misleading tracks caused by erosion and overlapping animal patterns, about the need to discourage public intrusion because it increases accident risk and damages protected habitat. I used language that would close doors instead of opening them. I let people roll their eyes. I let them call it a waste of time. I let the story starve rather than feeding it. And yes, that decision cost me. It cost me credibility with a few people who wanted a thrill. It cost me friendships with folks who believed I was hiding excitement for myself. It cost me sleep, because the truth has a way of pacing around inside you when you lock it up. But it also bought the forest silence. Over time, the buzz died down. The social media page moved on to other obsessions. Outsiders stopped driving out when nothing ever happened. Cal's closures became routine maintenance in the public mind. The pressure softened the way storms soften when they realize there's no roof to rip off. And I lived the rest of my career carrying a private understanding that changed everything about how I looked at fear. Fear isn't just an emotion. It's a force that gathers people into crowds and makes them feel justified. Now, years later, I'm telling you this in a confessional voice because I can feel the same question I asked myself earlier returning with more weight. What happens when I'm gone? I never shared their location. I never will. That's the line I won't cross, no matter how much disbelief this confession earns me. But I also don't want the truth to vanish completely, because the truth, handled gently, can teach something important. That not everything unknown is a threat, and not everything hidden is hiding because it's evil. I still keep one object in a tin box in the back of my closet. The carved wooden badge with the warning symbol and the word, "Remember." Sometimes I take it out and run my thumb over the grooves, and I think about the moment I almost misunderstood "don't shoot" as a plea to spare a creature from harm. It was never only that. It was a plea to spare the world from its own reflex, its own panic, its own entitlement, its own need to be first. Because the worst that happened in that forest wasn't what a giant did. It was what humans were ready to do the moment they believed they were afraid. And the only reason it didn't become a tragedy is because a wild girl, who wasn't wild at all, just wise in a way the town refused to imagine, stopped me before my fear could lead. I'm telling you now so you'll understand the difference. Some things aren't meant to be proven. They're meant to be protected.